We are discussing the problem of homeless people and anti-homeless architecture with Mr. Paul Zimmerman today. Mr. Zimmerman wears quite a few hats. Currently, he is an elected councillor in the district of Pokfulam, a position he has occupied since 2010. He is also very active in a number of organisations dedicated to urban planning, livability, and the protection of the environment. He is the founder and CEO of Designing Hong Kong, a non-profit organisation whose mission is, I quote, to promote sustainability, quality of life, and good design in city planning, development, and governance. He also serves as director of Civic Exchange. Civic Exchange is an independent public policy think tank whose main aim is to transform Hong Kong into a more livable place. The members of Civic Exchange conduct research on environmental, economic, social, and governance issues and promote dialogue with stakeholders to inform public policy in Hong Kong. Throughout your career, you have shown great interest in livability issues and in urban planning. Why are those issues so important to you?
Well, Hong Kong is a fantastic city to live. It's got great qualities as a high-density city compared to other high-density cities. There's a great mobility, there's a great accessibility of a great variety of activities that you can engage in one day, which I think makes Hong Kong a fantastic city to live. In the morning you can be in the mountains, you can swim in the afternoon, you can do business at an international level. And then you can have dinner with your friends and whatever food you want. If you take all of those experiences, there's very few cities that you can have that range of experiences all in one day. I think that makes Hong Kong a really great city. So then it comes to what doesn't work and how can you make improvements to the city. And that has become my focus after I stopped working commercially. Kind of like trying to figure ways of making improvements, because there's always things you can improve. Especially in the dense urban environment, there can be a lot of harsh situations. And as far as the rural environment is concerned, we have seen degradation and, kind of like redevelopment of green areas that are concerned.
According to research done at Civic Exchange, housing is by far the number one problem in Hong Kong. But let us concentrate on extreme examples. Do we know how many people in Hong Kong are living in subdivided flats or are rough sleepers?
The perception in Hong Kong is that housing is a real problem. But of course, 50% of the population lives almost for free in public housing. And then in terms of the private housing, the other half, a great part of that actually has paid off their mortgages because families have taken care and make sure that people have paid off. So it's a headline news about the cost of living here if you want to enter that kind of property sector where you own your own property, and that has driven this perception that housing is a real problem. But I must say, compared to other cities, again, that 50% of public housing is very different from what people may think. It provides a real good support for the kind of lower income families. Of course, this also works the other way around, that it's good for employers who can then have people living in low-cost housing, and therefore they don't have to pay them so much salary, which then stops these people from migrating up into an asset class of owning their own property or having savings. So it's a double-edged sword. But then with changes in population, we have people that are in the kind of, what I will say, a sandwich class, not a sandwich class in terms of income, but in terms of right to the public housing, not having that right, not having the ability to be in the private housing, and they're sitting in that sandwich area. And that's about 200,000 people in Hong Kong, about 90,000 households that are in that class, and they have kind of subdivided flats into small little units, and that is where they live. And those are not necessarily very comfortable, but I think the biggest issue is that there is a lot of safety issues involved there, where these flats are never built for that number of rooms, that number of people, and there are fire safety issues, and this is what the government must address. In terms of rough sleepers, the estimates are around 2,000 people sleeping rough in Hong Kong. But there's no hard count of number of rough sleepers.
Hostile architecture, particularly architectural elements targeting the homeless, seem to be quite common in Hong Kong. Is hostile architecture more widespread in Hong Kong than in other cities that you are familiar with?
It's hard to, again, put a hard and fast rule on whether hostile architecture is more in Hong Kong than in other cities. I think that is hard to pin down, but there is certainly quite a significant amount of hostile architecture in Hong Kong to stop people from illegally occupying street spaces, say under the highways, by putting up rocks there so you can't put any huts there, you can't put any cardboard boxes to live in. Then what has been airing a lot of people is these rings and on the benches so you can't sleep, you can only sit straight up because there are rings stopping you from laying down. And an awful lot of private properties where they have, say, nice windows and they may have a windowsill, they'll put all kind of elements to make sure that people don't sit there. And for us, we became aware of that a lot when we were looking at missing seats in the city. If we want, and for us it was a thing of making it not just from a social equity point of view, but more from a health point of view, that people would walk more. You would walk more if you can sit more. That was the principle that we go for. You're willing to walk further if you know there is a place to sit and rest, and then you would walk on. And if you don't have those public seats, then you're not going to do it. And when we were looking at the availability of seating in the city, we found it very, very limited. And so the seating that is available was limited very much from what we saw in the park areas. And in the park areas, kind of leisure cultural services department was very concerned about people sleeping on their benches in the parks, which to us is quite unfortunate to see that. I mean, why can't you sleep? It's like, but I must say, the attitudes are changing. Well, I think that the attitudes are changing. We are pushing more for more seats to be placed throughout the city. Where it probably isn't changing as much is, the response of private property owners to that seating issue. Whether they kind of like stop you from having ledges where you can sit on, or make it difficult for you to sit inside the shopping mall area by not providing any seating. There is only a very few developers that will do that right. I can give you one example. In Healthy Street, New World has just recently done up a new building, and there were always seats outside. There's people putting up their own plastic chairs. And that's where people were sitting, and there was a group of people, always the same guys would sit there, and I had conversations with them. They were not necessarily from the neighborhood, all of them. There were people that came from different areas. And then as the building next to it was being redeveloped, the seats kind of moved as the scaffolding came in, but then when the building was all done, suddenly the seats were gone. And in the building there was no design for the same guys to be able to sit in that same area. But what there was a planter, and the planter could easily have had an edge that could allow them to sit on if that was of concern, if that was a sensitivity that the developer had, and it was not there. So they kind of killed that community space and didn't even recognize that it was there. So there is that lack of sensitivity, I think, from developers, and lack of corporate social responsibility to provide public space as they redevelop. And make sure that their buildings provide opportunities for the public to sit and rest.
Are there any noticeable differences between wealthy business districts such as Central and poorer areas such as Sham Sui Po as to how anti-homeless architecture is employed?
I think the deployment of anti-homeless architecture, hostile architecture, varies by district, and so in the upper class district where expensive shopping and so on, it's really about a lack of seating, but also about a lack of opportunities for the homeless to have a meal or have access to some work like collecting cardboard boxes or otherwise, and that space is just not available for them. Whereas in the poorer areas, we'll see anti-homeless architecture, say for example by the departments who don't want people to sleep under the highway, and they make it very difficult for them. But then we see it easier for the homeless to actually have access to a meal, people that look after them, that will support them, or an opportunity for them to have some work in the informal sector that might be operating in that kind of district. So you see more homeless in the districts where they're not necessarily the wealthiest districts, but there is more interaction there. Although on one side there is the hostile architecture response, there is also positive response to homeless in the city, a caring response. For example, I became fully aware of that by seeing all the cardboard boxes with the homeless belongings hidden away in some locations in Chinchachoy in the waterfront during the daytime. And then the homeless come at night and they fold open and they find a place to sleep close to the waterfront. But by early morning, they have to disappear. And the security guards will kind of remind them, it's like, it's time for you to go. Because if you stay longer, then I have to clear you out. But if you pack up on time, I'm not going to do anything. So there is this tolerance and this acceptance that we see of homeless, whether it's in the park by the park managers or it's in McDonald's where people stay over. There is an acceptance and a support for people in need in the society that is quite contrasting to the kind of hardware architectural defense mechanisms that are put in place to keep people away.
I have rarely heard any criticism against anti-homeless architecture in Hong Kong or elsewhere for that matter. Are there any landscape designers, architects or urban planners actually raising their voices against hostile architecture in our city? And if not, why not?
The opposition to hostile architecture among the professional community, I think there is there, but it tends to be more among younger professionals or people still studying. And we see it in people that are more into social welfare issues, we see. But among the actual professionals, as soon as people are looking for a job here and need a contract, then it's usually the private property owners that pay for the architect to put the building together. And these private property owners are not necessarily welcoming design features which would inundate their property with homeless. So the tendency, therefore, maybe is for them not to be so focused on it. And then when it comes to the district councillors or people like that, their voters are probably not the homeless in that district, but the people that live there, that have a property there or have their home there. And again, they may not be necessarily the ones that would support more homeless in their district. There is, in Hong Kong, at some levels, you see private property owners, they don't want a public housing estate to be built right next to their homes because they think the value will go down. I mean, there is that kind of sentiment in the city. So I guess that in the past, at least, there are people that are not very supportive of that. Because you might have then complaints from your voters about people sleeping on the benches in the park, and that will have driven the LCSD, the Leisure Cultural Service Department, to put these defenders up so people can't sleep there. But I must say, I think things are changing somewhat, but it's not necessarily to homeless, but it is just that we now have lawns in the park where you can lay down and sit on and sleep, and you now actually see people bring little tents on a weekend and they stay there. So they're kind of the notion that you can sleep in a park is kind of increasing, not necessarily from the homeless side, but from the park users. Whether that then translates in less hostile architecture elsewhere in the city, where it may be more used by homeless, I hope so.
My last question is, who has the power to decide whether hostile architecture features should be incorporated or not into public spaces such as parks and streets?
So the decision making regarding, whether or not to put hostile architecture to defend space against homeless, or just people kind of sleeping in areas or sitting in areas, people that you don't want. In Hong Kong, is very much the private property developers, of course, the shopping mall operator, the one who puts the building up, instructs the architect. So their interface between private property and public space is quite strong in Hong Kong. I mean, we make a lot of use of private property to get to the train or to go to do our shopping. So there's a lot of basically public space in private development. So that's it. If it's public space which is controlled by government and it's either on the street, then it becomes the food and hygiene department, or it's in a park, then it's the Leisure Cultural Service Department. Especially the Leisure Cultural Service Department is under a lot of pressure from the district councillors and from people who complain about people sleeping in their park. It is how sensitive are they to it, and whether they put in features to stop them from coming in. We can see that in some of the parks. But I must say, there are also moments that they are tolerant in the way they know that the local residents will come at 7 o'clock in the morning for their morning activities, and then the street sleepers might be there in the night and sleeping, but then they've packed up early so that they don't disturb the residents, and they may tolerate that in some cases. But for outside that, the street is really the food and hygiene department, and then maybe that in response to their request, highways department may put in all kind of features to stop people from putting up structures in public spaces that are kind of related to where the highways are, where the flyovers are, where people may find nooks and crannies to put in their living space. In my view, hostile architecture is not very good for anybody. It's not good for the homeless, but it's also not good for the people that have a home in Hong Kong. If you want to enjoy the city, then the ability to sit somewhere, to rest somewhere, to put your head down is extremely important to the enjoyment of the city, but also for your own health. You know, I love walking in the city, but if you can't sit somewhere, then you wouldn't walk that far. You take transport to get to a point where you can sit or sleep. It would be so much nicer if the city allows you to rest and have a glass of water, or from a water refill point, or have a seat where you can rest, or a bench where you can lay down, or a place where you can have a snooze. And I think that makes the city so much more livable. And then if there are homeless that will make more use of it, so what? I think there is nothing wrong with that, as long as we can all share those spaces.